I'm going to guess that most people know who David is. It's really, I didn't make this up. Like I didn't try to invite David just the day after St. Patrick's, although obviously you're joining us from Ireland and you're Irish. So I'm glad that you're, you know, in a good place to give a presentation today. I doubt that there's many people who don't know who David is. And if you know a bit of David, then you know he's a physicist. He'll be more than happy to tell you that a number of times on any given conversation. He does a lot of things other than straightforward physics. He's a cancer researcher. He is also a science communicator. He has written a book that maybe you will mention about because I think it's coming to the United States starting in a few weeks.
It's next week, actually. Yeah, I've
Next
forgotten
week,
that.
yeah.
Thanks for reminding me.
Yes, I read the British version and it's great. It's about critical thinking, so it's definitely something we need to do a lot more about these days. But he's also a friend of IMO. He's been IMO a few times. He has participated. So you came to Moffitt some years ago and spent a few weeks, and then you came to quite a lot of IMO workshops. Work with me and Jacob Scott when Jacob was here. Keep working with us, and that's Philip. But that's very cute, Philip. Um, on that note, though, David, please take it on, and we're eager to see your presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that illustrious introduction. Some of you I know, some of you I do not. I will do a brief recap of what I'm talking about. If I'm speaking too fast, please do jump in. I've been speaking mainly to Irish people for the past few weeks, and I forget that I can speak very, very fast. Although most of you are used to David and Sandy and people who speak fairly fast themselves. But if I am not clear, please do jump in. Don't It's not rude at all. I'll keep the chat window open in case anyone wants to personally abuse me. There we go. I can see Heiko there as well. Hello, how are you? Okay, so can everyone see my screen all right? The first thing of starting these sessions off. Can everyone see a screen?
It's a beautiful screen, David.
Fantastic. All right, we're on a winner. So, for those of you that have talked to me in the past, that's many of you here I see, you'll know that I have quite an interest in oxygen and its role in, we're going to talk about today, in tumor evolution. I'm going to give you some background as to why that interests me. A lot of you will be interested in it too. And for those of you who aren't so interested in it, maybe you'll go away today being a little bit interested or very bored. We'll find out very quickly. So, the first thing to realize is that oxygen in cancer, this is not a new thing. This is not some recent discovery that I'm going to hype. This has been at the very fore of cancer research for probably about 70 odd years. So the slide here, you can see the corner is actually from a paper by Gray of the unit of radiation. And that was in the 1950s. And that was about cancer and lung tumors. What you actually see here is, I'll explain a little bit in a second, but a lot of you will recognize this as centralized chronic necrosis caused by hypoxia. So what actually happens, a very simple explanation of this you see in textbooks, is because you have hyperproliferation in tumors, you have a lot of cells. And as the oxygen tries to get out from the capillaries, it's consumed by those cells who need to take a certain amount to survive and thrive. So you start getting decreasing amounts of available oxygen right away from intermediate levels down to anoxia. And then the oxygen is eventually all consumed and you start getting necrosis, usually on the border of anoxia. And in lung tumors, you can get these interesting shapes like this. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The diffusion distance of oxygen depends on the oxygen consumption rate of that tissue, but it's typically between 100 to 200 microns, so not very far. So the most obvious manifestation of this is in chronic hypoxia, which is really important, and we will talk about that. So this is why it occurs. And it's in many ways a manifestation and demonstration of at least two of the hallmarks of cancer, if we're going to use that schema. I'm going to use the old school one, not the one with like a million different versions that they added on recently, but let's just look at the classic six model, if you will. So we know that replicability, sustained replication, and angiogenesis, whether you want angiogenesis or not, are pretty much hallmarks of cancer. I'm aware there's much more recent versions of this figure, but I'm going back to the year 2000 Cell publication because I was far too lazy to put that massive figure with loads of different things up, but a lot of you will know it. So what you tend to get with tumors is you have cells obviously growing at usually a much greater rate, whether they're growing with higher proliferative ability or they're not dying. So you could also argue It's that they are evading apoptosis as well, or a combination of these things. Whatever mechanisms you're talking about, you get a hyperabundance of cells, which is a bad thing for a variety of reasons, and you get sustained angiogenesis. So these cells are still signaling using VEGF and other vascular endothelial growth factor and other things like that. They are still telling the body essentially to build more vessels. Like, we want more vessels down here. The problem is this kind of messaging is all confused because these cells shouldn't be doing this. They are again, they're not listening to other cells. They have an insensitivity to anti-growth signals, and they really are not communicating in a way that healthy cells would. So when these networks tend to be built, they tend to be terrible. How terrible, you ask? Very terrible. So the problem with this sustained signaling is it's not usually if you get a cut or something like that and you get VEGF out there to regrow everything, it's quite ordered. If you see healthy vasculature, it's very ordered. It makes a lot of sense. You could look at it as a network analysis and it makes perfect sense. However, the kind of sustained VEGF signaling, it doesn't equate to logical or even reasonable output. It's like someone's trying to build train tracks, but they don't really know where the train is. They're not really paying attention to everyone else where the train stations are, and you get this mismatch. What you tend to get is very poorly perfused, tortuous, and chaotic vessels, right? Awful state of affairs. Because a lot of the time you may have vessels built down there that literally can't get any perfusion through them, or you might have vessels that loop onto themselves and close. None of this is considered. So what you end up getting is, even though you have this massive increase in angiogenesis, it's just not enough to compensate for the proliferative demands and the frankly half-arsed structuring that is going on. So what happens is you tend to get pockets of severe. Oh yes, am I advertising for Pepsi? Yes, I am actually, Philip. They don't pay me well enough though for my sins. You tend to get sustained regions of chronic hypoxia anyway. Now I can show you a bit of an image here, just to show you here. This is actually from something we did years ago. This is a mouse tumor, and this is a confocal microscopy image of vasculature in a mouse tumor, and this is a reconstruction with basically small cylinder elements to redo that. This is nothing like what a healthy situation should look like. It's an absolute mess. So that's just to give you an illustration of how chaotic these vessels can be. And that's just a small 425 by 425 by 272 cubic micron kind of region. So quite small. And even in that, you have a lot of stuff going on. And that really gives way to sustained chronic hypoxia. Even this compensatory mechanism just doesn't work. So, for example, this is again a related mouse tumor from the same murine line, and it's stained with DAPI, CD31, which is a vessel stain, a hypoxia marker EF5, which tends to light up with more intensity when you're less than 10 mHg partial pressure. And if you put them all together, you still see that even though there's a fair bit of vasculature, that's the green stuff pointing up, you still have sustained regions of pretty chronic hypoxia that you can't easily get rid of. And this is on a much bigger scale. That's 1 millimeter. So this tumor is relatively sizable, or this X-sized tumor is quite sizable.
Hey,
Section
John,
okay.
can I quick ask a question? This is
Sure,
Joel.
Joe. How you doing?
Just want to ask, you say sustained hypoxia. To me, I interpret that as that red region stays the same over time, as opposed to sustained in that there will always be about this much area of hypoxia, but it may be moving around. Is that relevant?
No, you were absolutely correct in the first interpretation. I should have been clearer there. Actually, there are different transient mechanisms of hypoxia. I'm going to kind of skip over them in this talk a little bit because they tend to, like, a lot of people will be aware of them. There's stuff that does occur, and again, all of this is changing in time. I mean, this whole system is evolving in time, and all we're talking about is snapshots of it. But with chronic hypoxia, it's usually diffusion limited. So essentially, it is that you can't get supply to it. Now, of course, you're going to get change in the vasculature. It's going to try and build more and more on. But if you have a poorly perfused unit that's just building on more train tracks, the train still isn't going to get to the station. So in general, when I'm talking about hypoxia in this, I'm talking about chronic hypoxia caused by diffusion limited oxygen supply. So it shouldn't change too much over. Hopefully that, yeah. Sorry, you're absolutely right to flag me on that because I wasn't clear.
Perfect.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. So, yeah, that was a really good question because some people are probably looking at me what I was talking about and I didn't define it very well. So absolutely fair. So again, what happens then is you get very chaotic oxygenation patterns in these regions where diffusion has basically cut out and you can't get it. And it's really inconsistent. This is just a simulation results for something from that mouse tumor. This is an old paper. I'm just showing it for way of illustration. So this region here, and these three planes that you can see here, depending on what assumptions you make about the level of perfusion and the oxygen consumption rate of a tissue, you get very different pictures across those three levels for the oxygenation or the oxygen partial pressure. And what you get regions that are incredibly well oxygenated, and you get regions that are virtually non-oxygenated. And again, it'll depend, it will change with the level of perfusion and the oxygen consumption rate of the tissue. But what you're seeing all the time, no matter what the assumption is, you see regions of lots of oxygen and regions of absolutely none. And that's not what you see in healthy tissue. So this is very much indicative of cancerous tissue, unfortunately. It tends to have a very chaotic supply and not something that you can easily look at and give a single number to, unfortunately. And this has ramifications for treatment too. A lot of you will have come across it in this capacity. This is where I came across it first. So this is, I was originally interested in radiotherapy and things like that, and understanding this knocked into it. So we know that oxygen has a significant impact on how effective chemotherapy will be and radiotherapy. So with regards to radiotherapy, we know low oxygen is associated with much poorer radiation response. And well, why is this? There's a few different models as to why this is, but oxygen fixation tends to be the most commonly relied on. So what I mean by this is a thing that we call the oxygen enhancement ratio. And it is a metric of the boost you get in cell kill under high levels of oxygen versus that you get under anoxia, or when your partial pressure is zero. And you can see it's a curve that saturates very quickly. So obviously unity, if you have zero oxygen, is 1. It's a bit of an awkward scale, but there we go. Historical reasons, that's how it's defined, so we'll stick with it. And then when you have a lot of cell kill, you can get up to, in principle, about a factor of almost 3 times more cell kill when you have a lot of oxygen. And that curve saturates very quickly. You can see it's reaches half maximum pretty early on at about 3 mmHg. And the reason why this kind of happens is to do with oxygen fixation. And I'll very quickly explain that. Just, it's not super important to what we're doing, but I just want to give a little bit of background on it because I have looked at it before. So essentially, in radiotherapy, you're sending schools of particles through human tissue, and the vast majority of these X-ray photons, we're talking about X-ray photon treatment specifically here, will go through the patient and not interact whatsoever. Because we are primarily water, however, some of those particles will interact with water most likely, and that will cause, here we have an electron coming in. You've got a charged particle, not a charged particle, you have an X-ray causing an exciting event, you have a charged particle hitting some water, and you get a proton lobbed off that, and you get an OH radical. OH radical impinging on DNA can cause DNA damage, but that DNA damage in the absence of oxygen is actually pretty readily fixed. We've evolved to have mechanisms of quick fixing for that, and I won't go into too much detail about them. However, in the presence of molecular oxygen, your OH radical combines with this O2 and creates a new radical, the damage of which is much harder to reverse. So the cell kill is knocked up. And very misleading term, we call that fixed damage. So when the OH radical meets with an O2 molecule, you tend to get damage that is fixed. So it's difficult to reverse. The problem, I think, with that terminology is when people think fixed, I think of DNA repair, or at least I do. And it kind of means the polar opposite of that. So it's easy to get confused, and hopefully I haven't confused people more. But essentially, in the presence of molecular oxygen, DNA damage tends to become fixed and more difficult to reverse. Without oxygen, the OH radical damage is relatively easily restored. And that knocks up how much cell kill you're likely to get. And that explains your ratios here, why you get a much more cell kill in the presence of oxygen. Why in chemotherapy, though, does low oxygen have a negative impact? The reason for that, and people can correct me if I'm wrong here, because chemo is not my main area of research. As far as I'm aware, it's down to vascular supply. A lot of drugs that need to get out into tumor tissue or into regions that are primarily affected need to travel through capillaries. And if you have poorly perfused networks and the kind of same nightmare that we had getting oxygen to places, it's probably not surprising that we have reduced uptake in chemo as well. Again, I am not going to stake my house on that one because it is not my area. But if anyone has insight into that, I'd love to hear it a bit later on. But to my understanding, that is why the chemo effects are much reduced as well. The radiation effects are the only ones I really understand. By the way, you might ask, well, we're talking about X-ray radiation here, old school photons. You might say, well, charged particle therapy, surely it's not going to be as big a deal. It actually is still, even in charged particle therapy. This is from a paper I did last year looking at this in PMB. So it turns out that until you go up to very high LETs with your charged particles, whether it be protons or carbon ions or whatever you're having yourself, it turns out that the oxygen enhancement effect is still very, very important, even up until until very high LETs. And for that reason, you never really eradicate at anything that you can use for therapy. You never really eradicate some kind of oxygen effect. So it is just worthwhile to point out you do circumvent it a little bit, because again, if you're, and the reason for that is if you're killing with charged particles, the oxygen enhancement ratio is the excess kills you can get. If you are killing pretty much everything on your first hit, there's a lot less excess to get. So when you go to crazy high LETs, you can, in theory, wipe out an awful lot of cells and not have to worry about that knock-on excess kill you could get from oxygen. However, at those levels, you could do a lot of damage to regular tissue too. So this is a bit hypothetical. In the regime that we're usually working around here, you still have an oxygen enhancement ratio, no matter what you do. So just a bit of background for that. This is a very old slide. Some of you will have seen before. This is back in the days where I thought I'd put all the words on a slide. I don't do that so much, so please don't try to read it because I know this is very wordy. But one of the things, we go back to very first principles and we look at avascular tumors. So again, we've talked about vascular stuff being a mess. Let's talk about a hypothetical situation where we grow a tumor spheroid, which is avascular. It's just a bunch of cells growing and growing and growing. And as they grow, they bulk up to the point where oxygen can't diffuse through them because it's being consumed before it gets to the center. The center becomes anoxic. They keep growing on the outside. Eventually, the center becomes necrotic, and you get these weird kind of shapes here. And this is kind of a model that we did of it years ago, but it looks pretty close to the real thing. You can see here, this is a proliferation marker, Ki67, which goes all the way pretty much to the center. I've overlaid them here just for simplicity. And that's EF5, which is the red stain. These are DLD1 tumor spheroids, which is a colorectal cell line. But you see the same thing in many different cell lines, and we've indeed looked at a good few of them. And it turns out you can model from first principles where the oxygen should go, because this kind of level of, this is a reaction diffusion equation with a constant consumption term. And you get the same thing, by the way, if you do an approximate solution with Michaelis-Menten kinetics, which is just uglier. I haven't put it in here, but you get pretty much the exact same result. And that's from an old paper from 2014. So we do know that the oxygen consumption rate, we can take away from that, shapes tumors, or vascular tumors anyway, because the level of necrosis you get, the viable rim and hypoxic regions, and you can get these from first principles if you wish, or you can measure them, or you can use something like Paul Macklin does with the Physicell and whatever, and you get the same kind of patterns. You get, depending on your consumption rates, you'll get different levels of necrosis. And that's telling us something else as well, because that also tells us that we can play a central role in hypoxia by manipulating OCR in principle. So one of the experiments we did in 2016 to look at that is, if in principle you can lower the oxygen consumption rate, you can reduce tumor hypoxia, because if the cells are less thirsty for oxygen, the oxygen can diffuse further and you get less regions of necrosis. We did this with HTC 116. I think that's also a colorectal line, isn't it? Yeah, and that was one of our control spheroids. Again, you have Ki67 and you have lots of EF5 in the center, so it's quite anoxic, or it's getting towards anoxia in the center. It's actually still hypoxic. And then when you treat it with gemcitabine, which is a common radio sensitizer, you start getting much reduced levels of EF5 uptake in the center. Part of that might be due to cytotoxicity, but even when you eliminate for that as well, you find that it seems to have reduced the oxygen consumption rate. And indeed, gemcitabine for a very long time has been a potent radiosensitizer. So that's perhaps one of the mechanisms by which it works, that it effectively reduces the demand for oxygen in the cells that uptake it. So that's one thing. And of course, you can knock onto this, because you're all modelers as well. A lot of you are. You'll start wondering, well, if this is true, does that tell you anything about tumor growth? And yeah, it kind of does. If you have two tumors, spheroids, and again, I'm talking avascular. We'll talk about vascular a bit later on. If I have two tumors and one has a lower OCR, you're going to have a much lower necrotic core. You're going to have much more viable cells here that can proliferate. than this case. If this is a higher OCR, you have more centralized necrosis. And in theory, these ones here will attain a much smaller plateau volume if they grow than this one here would, which would get to a much greater plateau volume. Incidentally, even though you don't force it in these, you can build a very simple model of this, which indeed a few years ago I did. And it turns out just on oxygen consumption alone, predicting on what sizes you would get with different things. And it turns out that yields the pretty classic sigmoidal growth that a lot of you will have seen. And that, again, depends on the average doubling time of the cells and the average OCR of the cell line. And we looked at that a few years ago. You could see it. I won't go into much detail because it's not really what I want to talk about today. But you could see it with different cell lines. That's really hard to read. I don't know why I put that in. So basically, we measured the estimated mass of different cells and their OCRs. And we then fit that to the data.
Hey, David, it's Heiko.
Ooh, hello. Did someone go in there? I heard something.
Hey, sorry, it's Heiko. I had the feedback. Can I ask a quick question to the previous?
You can, indeed. Please do.
Your sigmoid curves on the left-hand side, the parameters, what did they refer to? Your RL or whatever it was.
Sorry, what are we looking at, Heiko?
Your plots on the left-hand side, what are the RLs that give us these different?
Oh, yes. I'm kind of skipping over that because I'm putting in for historical reasons or anything else. This is actually called this RL ties into the consumption rate. It turns out to be it's related to the square root of it, or 1 over. It's so basically this is how big your spheroid can get before it starts to have centralized necrosis. And I should have probably, it would have been easier to plot this with the A as the oxygen consumption rate, but they directly relate to each other. And I won't go into too much detail on that today. I might come back to it at the end, but it's just because it's old work. I didn't want to skip over just to give some background. But effectively, you can view this as a function of the oxygen consumption rate A. So these ones here, this one here has a much higher oxygen consumption rate than this one here because the RL is shorter. It can only get, if you look at it like this analogy here, it is a much smaller radius it can achieve before it has centralized necrosis or centralized anoxia.
Okay.
Whereabouts this one here, you can only get to 200, where it's the one in red can get up to 300 before it starts having that impact. And you can, is that answered a little bit? I know I've kind of thrown that out.
It does, but if you were to zoom out and not only look for the volume at the onset of necrosis, does it change anything to the final tumor volumes these things can achieve?
That's a really good question, and one that I will try to answer in a few minutes. So hold that question in your mind, and let's come back to it in a few minutes. So hopefully that will work. All right. So again, this is what we saw with different cell lines. We would measure their oxygen consumption rate from first principles. We'd fit it to data. Sometimes it worked very well, which we saw with HC116s, LS174Ts, even breast cancer cell lines. It's very hard to measure the mass of cells. I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty unless people want to, but it was an absolute nightmare, a mixture of image analysis and confocal microscopy and many, many weeks in a lab that I will never get back. But you can do it. But you can also do it with other people have measured with SA. You can then fit that data as well, knowing something about the oxygen consumption rates, and that fits really well. And you see, like with V79 hamster lung kind of cells, you get the sigmoidal curve over a long period of growth. Most of the lab data we had was shorter period growth, but you still saw something that was consistent to what you would predict based on that. What I want to get the point across, though, not so much on growth today, because we're going to go into more evolution, which interests me more today. And I hope interests everyone a little bit here, because I think the IMO certainly has a really good history on this. So oxygen is a multiscale problem. It goes right down from the picometers and the tiny stuff that's happening at molecular level up to what you can see at the cellular metabolism level, the O2 limited diffusion level of 100 to 200 microns, sometimes 300, depending on what you have, the tissue scale with complex vasculature, what you can image. I won't talk about the imaging side today. That is another interest research area of mine, but it's not what I'm going to talk about today. What you can image on PET in millimeters and what you can treat at centimeter levels. So that's kind of a scale of oxygen being a nuisance on many, many scales. But there must be more than that. There has to be more than that, because standard hypoxia models alone cannot account for the observation that patients who have extensive hypoxia tend to fare more poorly than those with well-oxygenated tumors. You might say, well, it's obviously treatment being less effective. But even when you correct for that, it's not just treatment being less effective, because people that have extensive hypoxia tend to develop metastatic tumors a lot more than people that do not. So the emergence of metastatic phenotype seems to be very heavily correlated with extensive hypoxia. So what's going on? To answer that question, we can't just look mechanistically and say, oh, it's treatment impediments from low oxygen, which we kind of mechanistically understand. It's not that. It's something else. And we have to look at the evolutionary impact of a low oxygen microenvironment. So one approach, 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was 2015, I first came to the Moffitt, and I first met David and Jake Scott, and we started looking at this question. And one of the ways we wanted to test this was, it's a very hard question to test, and we'll talk about difficulties later on. But what we can do is model some simple things, and then we can compare that with some clinical data and see if they're at least consistent. And I'm going to talk about a bit of work that was 5 years in the making between Jake, David, Rob McCauley, Marnix Jansen over in London, and myself. And I want to talk to you about a very simple model that some of you will have seen before. It's a model based on something Jacob Scott came out with in 2014 with a little bit of added stuff. And it'll allude actually to one of Heiko's bits of work from 2009 as well. So hopefully we'll get a bit of a story out of this. So let's talk about a very simple model description. In 2014, I think it was in plus compile, and with a little bit of an extra bit on it. By the way, is my internet connection okay? Sometimes it goes. I just got a warning it was unstable. Can you hear me okay?
So far, so good.
Nice.
Works.
Okay, good. When I get that warning sign, I always just stop for a second. I live in the sticks outside rural Dublin, so sometimes the internet just decides it doesn't want to work for a while. Hopefully that won't happen now. So this is a very simple model where we begin, we simulate a cancer microenvironment, and with different oxygen levels, and we throw in a cancer stem cell, and we put that at some random location. So to divide, cells need to have space and they need to have oxygen. We know from experimental data that cells can keep dividing down to very low oxygen. Peter Vapol did some work on this. I think it's about 0.5 mmHg, really low, and they can still happily work away. So we take that as kind of a threshold for when things can go on. In very low oxygen niches, we give cells a non-zero probability of dying or undergoing apoptosis each time step, because they do have, we know from experimental data, again, they don't just survive forever in low oxygen environments. They tend to relatively quickly start dying. We also assume that cells can divide symmetrically to another stem cell with some probability, or with a different probability, 1 minus that probability, they can become transient amplifying daughter cells, TACs. In Jake's original model, there was a third level of cells, fully differentiated ones, but it turns out in the simulations, it didn't really make much of a difference for what we were doing. So for simplicity, we've kept it at 2. Stem cells are effectively immortal in this model. They won't die unless something really nasty happens to them. TACs have a limited number of divisions before apoptosis. We simulated that with different values, like Jake's work before that. And what we did in each case was we recorded the divisional age of each cell, and that's essentially how many times has that cell undergone mitosis, and how many generations is it born from? If it's the 17th daughter of a stem or whatever else, that kind of stuff we recorded. The model schematic might make more sense of it. So the very simple schematic of a model is this. You have a stem cell, right? And a stem cell, the first thing it does on the iteration is it checks its oxygen level. So it checks if it's in that critical region. If it has enough O2, it's above 0.5, it goes, cool, happy days. If it doesn't, if it's been spawned in a really low region, with some probability, it might die. Right, it's relatively low, but I can't remember. I'll pull the table in a while. I can't remember what the number was, but it will die in those regions eventually, left long enough. But if it does have enough oxygen, it checks the space around it. If it doesn't have enough space, it goes into quiescence. If it does have enough space, it undergoes mitosis, and it picks a random grid pattern around it and puts itself in it. It has a probability P of being another stem, and then we're back to the next iteration to this. If it doesn't, if you roll your random dice and if it's not quite that threshold, it'll have an asymptomatic division and it'll become a TAC. And then again, you have something very similar. It checks the oxygen levels on its division. If it's too low, probability P, it rolls a dice whether it dies or lives. The only extra difference in the TAC is it checks how old it is. It's like, how many times have I divided? And if it's below that threshold, it'll go, okay, cool, divide. Space, no space. TACs can only become TACs, so they only have one step in their mitosis. Whereabouts, if it has divided too many times, it goes, it's time for me to die. And it goes off and dies. If you want to, I mean, I know this in theory relies entirely on the stem cell hypothesis, which I know can be controversial. If you want to get rid of that and pretend all stem cells are clonogenic, you just see the stem cell and you make the probability of it becoming another stem cell 1. So we did that as well in the model. So we decided to look at it both ways. It turns out, spoiler alert, it doesn't actually change the results. So we're going to see, what did that tell us? We also had clinical data as well. So one of the things that we had access to with Robert Macaulay and his team was human glioblastoma data. And the reason why this was interesting is, firstly, it was available, and you all know how hard it is to get good data and to make it available. And one of the reasons it interests me is that glioblastoma is a real nasty cancer. It's a brain cancer, so it's one of the ones that can kill you as a primary. So it's a really nasty piece of work. But it does also create regions of severe hypoxia and resultant necrosis and pseudopalisading necrosis and things like that, features that neurosurgeons and neuropathologists are well familiar with. So we had access to something we know it has extensive regions of hypoxia in it by default. We also had these sections, they were triple stained. They were stained with H&E, Ki67, a proliferation marker, and P53 markers. P53 markers can pick up P53 mutations, but they can also pick up regions of chronic physiological stress. I will talk about this a little bit later, but the sections we looked at were also next generation sequenced, and we were not found to have P53 mutations. So when we saw P53 in this, we could safely assume that was a marker of physiological stress. So that was good as well. So what we did next was we had a neuropathologist, Robert Macaulay, who demarked regions of necrosis by hand. So we had these very high quality, pathology slides, and he would get there and sit there with his virtual pen and mark off regions that he would see as consistent with necrosis. What I did next was take an image analysis algorithm with these co-registered images. The first thing it would do is make sure they were all lined up and co-register them. It would count cells with a particular feature and ascertain how far from the necrotic or low oxygen boundaries they were. Some of you who have a computer science background will probably think of really clever ways to do this. Spoiler alert, I did not do it a clever way. I did it the most stupid and computationally intensive way possible, and I loved it. So essentially what we did here, this is a brute force way of doing it. The boundary here, you can see here, this is what Robert would have sketched in. I found the XY coordinates, these are 2D planes, the XY coordinates of all these, and then I found, say, with the Ki67 stain and the P53 stain, I'd mark red the ones that were positive, and in this case in Ki67 blue the ones that are negative. And then I would manually count the distance from every possible marker on that boundary and find the minimal one. So this is an incredibly inefficient algorithm. Luckily, I have a Titan X NVIDIA GPU, which they kindly gave to me sitting on my computer. And I basically forced it into a thing. Any computer scientist worth their salt looking at that will shake their head in disgust. And if I was doing it again, I'd probably do it in a more clever way. But luckily, I'm very stupid. And this is the only way I knew to do it. Because what we essentially wanted to do is work out something about the properties of these different cells with different properties and where they showed up in relation to these necrotic boundaries. And also what that could tell us about things. So this is how that algorithm is done. Brute force at its absolute finest. So now, let me go back to a hypothetical question and talk about the mutational risk of hypoxia. So why are we so interested in this? Why would hypoxia potentially be a great crucible for mutation? Well, here's a hypothesis that cells in the hypoxic niche, that is in the very low oxygen periphery, are at a higher risk of mutation. That's a hypothesis. For a clonogenic cell, let's assume the rate at which mutations accumulate per time, gamma, is related to the division rate, which we'll call G, the intrinsic rate of mutation per division, or D. I'll skip the derivation here, but using the binomial approximation, you can work out the probability of mutation with respect to time will be given by some function m of t, which is Poisson statistics because it's memoryless. It's 1 minus the exponent of the exponential function of minus or d, which again, we've just defined there as the intrinsic risk of mutation, times g times t. Now let's further assume under conditions of high cellular stress, where the environment is really not that conducive to cell survival, that the intrinsic risk of mutation increases a bit. So now we have RS and a GS. We have some slightly higher risk of mutation, and we have some maybe slightly different divisional rate. So here's a follow-on question from that. We still have our hypothesis we want to test, right? So, but what if cells in the hypoxic rate reduce their, what if cells in the hypoxic niche just reduce their division rate? There is some evidence that cells in the boundary of hypoxia become quite quiescent. There's also evidence that says they don't. So the literature was conflicting on this. Because in that case, it would be entirely possible that because the parameter g of s would be less than g, then hypoxia wouldn't become a selection pressure for metastatic phenotypes, because it would either be lower or the same as the bog standard rate. Even if the intrinsic risk was higher, the rate happening less would fall down. Alternatively, if they are still dividing around the same rate inside or outside of necrotic or hypoxic regions, then because ORS would be greater than ORD, hypoxia would then likely be a selection pressure for metastatic phenotypes. That's really hard to test with the data we have at hand, because you can't do that from first principles. But what we can do is look at what we have and see which conjecture is most in agreement with the data. What is most consistent with what we know? If we find there's no discernible difference in the mitotic rates in areas very close to that green border or far away from it, it is very likely that the hypoxic niche warps evolutionary velocity. It is a upregulator of this kind of mutations. A very simple test you can do to check this, you can cross-compare the distribution of P53 stains with Ki67 stain cells, and you can work out how far they are from the border. Let's talk about that first, second. But before we do that, we'll get that from the clinical data. Let's first look at what the modeling, this very simple simulation, would tell us. Well, here's what it told us. This is a paper published in British Journal of Cancer just last year. So we simulated these different oxygen microenvironments, and we just let the cells do their thing and grow out there. And what I've done here is I've counted the number of cell divisions after the simulation was finished. We ran this a few thousand times at random seeding, and these are very different oxygen microenvironments taken again from actual real excised tumors, just to show you the variation. You can have stuff that's like 0, you have 3.8 here, up to 95, so up to very well oxygenated to virtually non-oxygenated, and similar kind of stuff here. And what you see, no matter what way you take your oxygen microenvironment, whether it's from literature or you simulate it yourself, what always happens is the oxygen part, is that the number of divisions, stem cells of divisions are much upregulated on hypoxic niches. So when oxygen is low, they tend to happen more. There's a very intuitive reason for why that would happen. Because on the hypoxic niche, if you create a new daughter cell, you're as equally likely to knock it out of a park into where it's likely to die from being starved as you are into the survivable zone. So what happens is you tend to get stem cells kind of colonizing these zones where they can just about survive. And if they have enough room, they'll push their offspring in one way, and the other room they will knock it into the ether, and it'll eventually die. So that is kind of intuitive, kind of actually what we'd expect in one way. I should note, Alex Fletcher and I did a paper also last year on the fact that contact inhibition and stuff like that really should be factored into this kind of stuff. But you can still get around this by saying, well, look, these cells are still going to be going this if they are having contact inhibition and they are pushing each other and stuff like that. Sorry, I'm saying that backwards. Contact inhibition breaks down more often than not in tumors, but you'll still kind of get this upregulation no matter what way you do it. We did simulate that too. It was messier, but I'll talk about that later. We'll keep it simple for now because I am a very simple creature. And what interests me as well is Heiko had a really interesting paper from a long time ago now, to make us all feel old, from 2009 in Cancer Research. And one of the things, if I've understood it correctly, that really fascinated me, was that he got this kind of, if you have daughter cells that are long-lived, you can get this cool firewall effect, where basically long-lived daughter cells can actually reduce the tumor invasion, if that makes sense. Heiko will probably jump in and explain to me later on. I'm making a balls of explaining that, but hopefully I kind of have. We actually started seeing that, but under certain conditions, we had a really interesting result. If we seeded oxygen cells, this is a very simple example of an oxygen distribution, just for simplicity. If we seeded cells in very high oxygen environments, we actually got very similar results to Heiko. The paper is Paradoxical Dependencies of Tumor Dormancy and Progression on Basic Cell Kinetics. It's a classic. I advise everyone to read it. And we saw that kind of behavior that similar to what Heiko had seen. But we found if we seeded it in the periphery on very low oxygen environments, what actually happened is the cells could kind of break free of that firewall. They could actually, the green cells here are stem cells and red cells are daughter cells. So here there's green in the center, surrounded by red cells. And what we started seeing, if we see it in a low oxygen environment, is that started breaking down. Because what would happen is the stem cells would colonize that niche and spread much more than they would otherwise. And that became really interesting. So we kind of started calling that the edge creep effect, that in all our simulations, no matter what assumptions we put in, that kept being seen. And that was really interesting too, because that might suggest that in hypoxic regimes, you can kind of, it can be worse to be on the, it can be worse for the patient if cells start colonizing those regions, because they can kind of use that to creep and invade where otherwise they would have been maybe hemmed in, which is really interesting. So what did the clinical data tell us? Simulation can only tell you so much. What did we see? And again, with the whole caveat that you can only get a certain amount from interrogating clinical data like this, but we tried to get a good bit. The first thing with our image analysis algorithm is we sorted data into bins of their distance in micro, and I think in steps of 25 micron away from those. And the reason that 25 was chosen is it's roughly twice the width of a tumor cell. There was a whole logic to it. I can't remember it off the top of my head. And we binned it in there. And what you saw is that, and this was quite significant using KS non-parametric tests, this data was incredibly non-parametric because of the way the things have been. So we had to use non-parametric testing. But we had 23 samples from 9 patients, ranging from a couple of millimeters up to huge chunks of like 10, not tens of centimeters, but like several centimeters long. So there was quite a range in it. And we basically in every time worked out what the minimum distance was to the nearest necrotic border and kind of put that into a distribution. And here you can see that the P53 cells are on, they have much higher probability of being close to a necrotic border. That shouldn't surprise us because we already know from previous work that people have done with brain tumors like this is that you do tend to get extensive hypoxia, and that's saying these regions are chronically stressed. Again, we had next generation sequencing too that said that they weren't P53 mutants per se, this is chronic stress. And we saw, again, that was up elevated. But what else did we see? We saw more than that. We also were able to work out what the mitotic rate was, roughly, because now we have all this data binned. And we can say, look, what are the proportion of Ki67 active cells and Ki67 negative cells in those regions? Because if you would see, if there was quiescence near the necrotic border, we'd expect the fraction of cells undergoing mitosis to be, and this is again, these histologies are snapshots in time, right? They're not dynamic, they're just little snapshots, but they tell us something. We would expect if quiescence was a big problem with these tumors, or not a big problem, probably a big mechanism, we would see a smaller fraction. What we actually found is no matter where you went, no matter like what bin you went through, we got a very consistent fraction of about 21% all the time. And we saw no trend with distance from necrosis. We saw some variation. I think the standard deviation was 0.014 or something. So 21 plus or minus 1%. But it wasn't a trend that went down one or the other. It was just random around that. And we saw that in all the tumors, which is really interesting. So the preliminary conclusion we draw from that is that our mitotic rate, even in those zones, is approximately equal to what it is in the other zones. What that then suggests, and again, this is all suggestion, this is all just, is the experimental data consistent with different existing hypotheses, that would suggest the mutational risk is increased in the hypoxic niche, which may explain the emergence of metastatic phenotypes, which again, if you roll the dice of evolution long enough and you're doing more and more events like this, is that what's happening? Quite possibly. Finally, just to show you a nice picture on this, and well, not quite finally, we're getting close to the end. This is a kind of picture we did. We took those P53 stains, and I put a Sheether-Jones kernel over them just so you can see them a bit better. Where there was a high abundance of P53s, these contours are much, much higher. And actually, it matches very, very well with the lines that Robert has drawn. You see this green line here? It's hard to see because I've over. So the density of P53, that made perfect sense because these regions are chronically stressed. And then you have Ki67 positive cells, little green dots, or blue dots, sorry, are Ki67 positive cells. The argument here is we would say, based on what we see, this is consistent. It's not proof positive, but it's consistent with the idea that cells that are dividing in these regions are going to have higher mutational risk than the cells that are dividing here, where the stress is less, where the oxygen is probably a lot better. This borderland, we think, is where things might be happening. And there's an argument there that you can say this is kind of a map, a contour map of potential evolutionary velocity. That's, again, these are huge samples. That's 500 microns across. So this is a fairly big section. Again, this is all speculative to a degree. I need to talk about the limitations and conclusions of this, because, again, this is not a smoking gun. It's just interesting. So all things being equal, it does seem quite likely from a mechanistic and modeling standpoint that hypoxia could well function as a crucible of pressure, which selects for various phenotypes, including the emergence of metastatic phenotypes. The clinical data we saw was consistent with that interpretation, but again, not a smoking gun, just not enough evidence to falsify it, which I was interested either way. If we'd found that the mitotic fraction was much reduced, then quiescence would have been such a big factor that we could go, well, look, it's probably not likely. But because it didn't seem to be reduced, it is consistent with that. It's important to note, though, there's limitations on this kind of histological data. It's a snapshot in time, taken from real patients who have real complicated histories, some of which you don't have. In fact, for our cases, for ethical reasons, we had almost none of these patients' histories. We couldn't interrogate it for precise oxygen distribution, so we had to use necrosis and P53 as a proxy for that. It's a pretty good proxy, but it's not a guaranteed thing. There's other reasons cells could be stressed. Even though we know from literature it's probably hypoxia, it's not a guarantee. So for me, it's not a smoking gun. And there's a degree of inference that we have to even take from how we did this. Robert could sometimes mark things out in the samples, and other times it was too ambiguous. He said, I don't know. So we couldn't use that. So we ended up having millions of cells to look at, or, well, 1.2 million cells, I think. But that still in itself doesn't tell us the full picture. So what about the future? What would I like to see to make this better? I still think that understanding why oxygen gives rise to metastatic and detrimental phenotypes is incredibly important. So what we really need is a combined experimental and predictive model. And to do that, I'm going to need to work with people that are good with experimental data and know what they're doing, because this is really, this is going to need animal data. Potentially cell, but mainly animal data. I have a few ideas on that if people want to chat to it later on. I'm particularly interested in hearing from experimentalists. I'm interested in hearing from everyone, if I haven't bored you to death. I am always open to collaboration, because I'm basically an academic prostitute of the first degree. So if anyone ever wants to work on this stuff, I'd love to. And finally, I'd like to thank some people who are involved in this. Obviously, my university in Dublin City University. The other university I'm affiliated with it is Oxford. CRUK, who gave us the initial grant to start this project. The Wellcome Trust, who currently fund me when they feel like it. And then Marnix Jansen, David Basanta, Jacob Scott, and Robert McCauley, my co-authors. And of course, everyone at IMO and Sandy as well. I'd like to thank you folks as well. So thank you for listening. And absolutely feel free to throw questions at me, or insults, or whatever you want, really.
Not tomato, though. It's a bit hard.
I'm not in the IMO, so if you can throw a tomato from Florida to Dublin, I am impressed on so many levels anyway.
Yes, I completely forgot when I was introducing you, and to notice the fact that you're actually a lecturer, which is assistant professor at DCU, and that you still can keep your affiliation with Oxford. It was a great presentation, David. Thank you very much. I think that there's going to be some questions. I see that Andre is just basically about to jump. So,
yeah, very cool stuff. One kind of minor sort of technical comment. It doesn't make sense to talk about metastasis when talking about glioma, because there's local invasion, which is not any less lethal. But the sort of more substantial thing, while it makes perfect sense that hypoxia might be selecting for more invasive phenotype, there's also very strong evidence that this is not necessarily a selection or Darwinian process, where basically exposure to hypoxia can basically induce phenotypic switch toward a more migratory phenotype. So, I mean, I suspect most likely in reality, you might be dealing with a combination of the induction and selection. So have you, and I think one thing is important to really try to reject the null hypothesis that it's all about the induction before bringing the selection angle. And then my question is, like, have you thought about how to combine the induction and selection aspects of the impact of hypoxia on cell migration?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because to me, the data we have at the moment is not conducive to actually interrogating that question. It's snapshot that it's fantastic, and we were very lucky to get it, but it doesn't tell us enough. I think the way you have to separate that out, and I might be annoying you in this in the future because you were in my head about this recently. I think you'd have to tease that question out. I think the only way that I can see is probably first principles animal experimentation, where you set up some way to do it. I don't think you can do it retroactively. Much as lazy as I am, and as much as I'd love to do it retroactively, I think that is real. But if you'd be interested in chatting on that later, I'd love to hear your insights into it, because I think you're absolutely right. I can't tease out the processes now with what we have, but I think you could design experiments to potentially tease out those processes and even more. And maybe that's an avenue worth looking into.
Yeah, happy to talk about it later.
Well, you've committed now in front of witnesses, so I'll be annoying you on that later on.
I had a question. I thank you very much. Nice talk. And so, I mean, can you comment on different tissue type, tissue of origin, and the fact that brain is to be expected lower oxygen concentration normally anyways than others? So usually, right, the tumor surrounding tissue and its oxygen concentration might differ very much if you compare different tissue types. And
you'll definitely get you'll definitely get huge variation in tissues. And again, we only had this data, but one of the things that interested myself with and Jake to a degree is that because brain tumors are so devastating, they've been fairly well studied when it comes to resections, and I suppose the pathological data on brain tumors as well is well existent. So we do know that actually overall brains are fairly well oxygen supplied, but it's very easy to make them go haywire. I mean, I guess you could even argue a stroke or something like that, or trans ischemic attack is a good example of how quickly oxygen depletion will cause damage in the brain. But the pseudo-palisading necrosis is actually what had got Robert Macaulay interested in it. And these are distinctive features of hypoxia in the brain. You are absolutely right in so much as to make this generally applicable as a mechanism of cancer in general, you need to start looking at how this manifests in other tissues, because brain is a weird, I totally accept brain is a weird
tissue. But that might also point to the fact that maybe the mechanism leads to a completely opposite prediction in other tissues.
It might, absolutely.
Right?
And the only way we're going to answer that is if we get data and interrogate the hell out of it, which I'm all for.
Not perfect. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have a question from Yabukyo, who just kindly put this question on the QA window. Quite intriguing simulation results from a single model of O2-dependent growth in space. Localized cell growth in high O2 versus delocalized migrant cell growth in low O2. These two distinct growth patterns arise from the cell growth depending on two conditions, the availability of space and O2. Any insight about these two different growth patterns?
Yeah, a little bit actually. And you know what? I will say that even as I was coding up this simulation, I realized that I'm a very lazy person, okay? Because one of the, in theory, if you get, and there's the people in the IMO for a very long time have been doing fantastic hybrid models and stuff with clever mechanisms, both lattice, non-lattice, off-lattice kind of stuff. If you assume that you have basically contact inhibition in cells, and this is an interesting point, and one I don't know the straight answer to, but if you assume contact inhibition is a real factor in tumor, and which some tumors it probably is, and some it maybe isn't so much, you will eventually get, your growth will effectively stop at the core because you'll get quiescence quite quickly. You can then model it, and you kind of get, if I remember correctly, depending whether you do this in 2D or 3D, you get actually quite different dynamics. And because essentially, if you do it in 2D, you have things on the edge can grow because everything else comes quiescent. It gets more complicated when you start trying to factor in things like cell pushing. I tried to look at a very lazy version of this with Alex Fletcher last year. So one of the suspicions is in a lot of tumors that contact inhibition breaks down. Mm-hmm. So cells will literally keep pushing until they physically cannot push, until their spindles are so compressed they can't even do it. The assumptions you get from that are very, very different for growth. So one of the things I was mindful of in doing this is I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to start with as simple a model as possible and no simpler, if that makes sense. And because Jake had done this absolutely fantastic model to answer a different question, we already had a skeleton for it. What I'd love to see, and I think what might be very different when you talk about the two different kind of growth type, I think that will really, really depend on what assumptions you make about things like cellular pushing and contact inhibition. As for the other part of it, sorry, your question was there for a second. It's disappeared on me. Yeah, you had a second part of a question, which I'm not answering. Do you have it there, David? You wouldn't mind repeating the last part?
But I thought it was just basically one question, which is two different parts of growth depending on space and oxygen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As to oxygen, that's really weird because you still actually get growth with oxygen, like right up to very, very low concentrations. And we know this from biological data, like cancer cells keep going at the usual breakneck pace in most cell lines until you really deplete them of oxygen, and then they get a little bit fussy about it. But like that's really low. So if you can get right to the periphery, in theory, you don't even have any impediment to your rate. It's only when you start getting over that threshold and you're going in and out. And again, that will probably depend on pushing, shoving, that kind of stuff as well. So I know it's not a great answer, but I can only tell you what we did. And as the rest, I'd be really interested in seeing what it did. But the only reason I didn't go in there is that, again, I don't like adding assumptions onto assumptions if I can avoid it. And I already felt I was making enough assumptions given the ropiness of the data. So in future, I'd like to look at that though.
Cool. I know that Heiko has questions as well. Unsurprisingly, Heiko.
Hey, David, really nice work. Thank you. That was excellent. A couple of questions. So in your stem cell model, for mutations to actually have an effect, they must establish in stem cells, right? Because everything else will be washed out. So in your hypoxic area, you get an accumulation of stem cells. So for mutations to really manifest, probably makes sense for them to manifest in the hypoxic area. So do you think the observation that mutations coming out of hypoxic areas really has anything to do with hypoxic or the accumulation of stem cells in that area?
That's actually, I think that's a real insight there, what you just said there. I think it probably has to do with an accumulation of clonogenic cells. And I know that you can start a fight in parts of the IMO if you go in and say stem cell hypothesis but it doesn't matter as long as we'll say clonogenic cells in any kind of capacity. I think you hit the nail on the head. I suspect it's not specifically the low oxygen that has any real impact, apart from the fact that that's like herding sheep into a region where they're constantly dividing, and because their division is up. This is my guess. I could be totally wrong, and people could argue with me vehemently on this. But I think the upregulation, if you just keep, every time you recombine, every time you divide, undergo mitosis, you take your DNA and you shuffle it. And your chances of screwing something up in the process are non-zero every time. And I suspect upregulation of that process, anything that creates that process, and there is one specific thing I would like to look at in future, and maybe this is an experimentalist thing. One of the things I do think that might be slightly different in a low oxygen environment is, and this goes back to Warburg mechanisms, if we end up seeing a higher switch to glycolysis, one of the byproducts of that is increased lactate and acidity in that tumor region. I also wonder if you get a competing evolutionary pressure where cells that can survive and lactate a little bit better might be there as well. In this model, I would say absolutely it's just increased division, but whether that's increased division plus better survivability for these hardy, nasty types because they can survive, say, in higher lactate, that is a question for a very eager experimentalist who wants to bang their head off a table with me for a while. I'd be happy to look at that.
Yeah, very cool. I like your answer, David. So one other thing to that, which you didn't have in there, I'm pretty sure I've read it often enough to reproduce it here, is that stem cells upregulate self-renewal in hypoxic conditions. So right now you have your self-renewal probability to be constant, independent of the environment. But if you were to make that a function of oxygen pressure, then you probably can even accumulate or increase the speed at which you accumulate stem cells in your perivascular niche, and then have an even greater or faster baseline of mutation.
And that would amplify the effect even further, which would make it even. Yeah, that's fascinating. In fact, I might pick your brain on that in future because, again, I was being very lazy and I was going for I won't say lazy. I'm saying, like, the trying not to assume too much with limited data. But it is interesting, and I'd love to look more at it. And I think I'm talking to the right people, which is always great. So,
Sandy?
Yeah, thanks, David. That was entertaining as always. I guess I was intrigued about a couple of aspects or a couple of assumptions, and I know going with the parsimonious approach makes sense, especially when there is limited data. But since you're specifically looking at kind of, how mutation is going to be impacted by hypoxia, I think you can't escape the fact that mutation and selection are going to be entwined there.
yeah.
And so from that point of view, how robust that hypoxic environment is could have a direct impact. And what I mean by that is there's some evidence, and I think Joel touched on this, for sort of cyclic hypoxia type situations where you're going to have
effects and things.
kind of reoxygenation due to vascularization, and then maybe it becomes hypoxic again. And then from a selection point of view, in those sort of bursts of nutrients, you've got more proliferation and then potentially selection as a result of, a starvation again event. And so, whilst you don't need to include explicitly that, one could cycle highs and lows and see what would sort of occur in your model, right? You could potentially try that.
Yeah, that's actually a brilliant idea, because again, and you're right. I mean, I like to say I like the way you said parsimonious, where I would just say lazy for me. But you're absolutely right. Again, it is. I think you're going to see multiple, and it kind of goes back to what Heiko asked as well. You're probably going to see multiple different mechanisms occurring at once. It's decoupling them with the limited data that makes it quite hard. I think we can simulate it easier than we can decouple it, with the exception of if we actually started this experiment from the ground up, designing it like we model it first and say, we think if this happens, you'd see this is the distinguishing feature, and then worked with experimentalists to put it up. I think that's probably the ground up approach is best. For me, simulating it with those different things would be absolutely possible, but decoupling them, because I think what you'd see, the net output would probably look, I would think, maybe I would think it would look similar. I don't know. Actually, that's something I should go and dig out.
Well,
the code.
my gut is actually it would amplify it further because you would get stronger selection.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually, actually now you say that, it probably is true. I should dig out the code and play with that. I
Should
might
do
have
it.
to. I should. When you've submitted a paper, you go, I never want to look at that again. I've gotten past that now, so I might go back and look at it. But again, anyone wants to work with me on this, I'm always happy to, because I keep agreeing to more than I can possibly do.
Well, I have to tell you, we have to reach out to you on a related project that has to do with everything you said, plus genetic instability.
Sounds great.
Which also plays around there. So I'd love to pick your brain in April, hopefully.
Oh, absolutely.
And another comment. Could it be that your ability to secure Wellcome Trust funds might be inversely related to the amount of I'm stupid in saying that you're lazy in your talks, or stupid?
To be honest,
you got to promote yourself, man.
Yeah,
this is all very clever.
But one of the things I will say, though, is the Wellcome Trust funding is actually to look at meta research. It's one of my other areas of research is looking at why so much research is absolutely terrible. So I don't make myself popular. My next paper is actually debunking a series of Nature papers, and that's being published in a sub-Nature journal. So I'm not going to make any friends with that, but I do feel that is
very important. Very important.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, David.
My pleasure. And if anyone, again, if you ever want to get in touch, folks, I'm always open to stuff. And now that things are slowing down a little bit, I would always love to collaborate. And I'd love to get over and work with you again at some stage in the future when we can travel, when we're allowed. I don't know, all meet up and talk to human beings. That would be lovely.
How's that? I forgot how that works.
You're happy about that, David.
If we have time, I would like to ask another selfish question. So I really like the analysis of the pathology slide that you had that we color coded for etc. Do you know of any of that being available with the stem cell marker? Because of course, you have this beautiful slide where you compare the contained growth versus the low oxygen marginal growth with the accumulation of stem cells. I would suspect that where you have your green line here, you would then, or where you have your hotspots of red, you would hope to see an increase in stem cells. Do any of these data exist where somebody has stain pathology slides for stemness?
You know, I not that I'm aware of. Now, if anyone wants to correct me on that, I'd be delighted to hear it, because that kind of stuff would have made a better smoking gun for me. I mean, if we could just see that, it would be great. We didn't even see upregulation, in particular of Ki67 in those regions. So our clonogenic stuff seems to be going on pretty uniformly throughout the board. But something that's more specified that can tell us about cells that are of a particular, that would be much better. If anyone knows if that's possible, absolutely, I'm all ears. But unfortunately, I don't know myself of its existence, although I really would like it to exist. That would be great.
I think it's possible. I just haven't seen it, so I was hoping you would have it.
Afraid not. But if you come across it, Heiko, give me a shout, because I'd like to look at that.
I don't know. Wasn't Polyak and Mishor, when they did fish analysis, when they had localization of stemness? Is Andre still here?
Yeah. I mean,
is this true? I mean, with their variants of fish, there was at least something.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at the CD24, CD44 marker. I mean, it's not kind of
in breast
exactly the sort of the marker of stemness per se, although one is more flexible epigenetically than the other. Anyway, sort of, now it's not really a believer in sort of a context-independent stemness, and to me, it sort of also doesn't quite make sense that you consider stem cells things in themselves, because it's always niche dependent. Otherwise, you would have basically stem cells would be kind of growing as a ball, like regionally, and instead you have them sort of dispersed through the environment and in a way that might be kind of changing with tumor progression. But it's a sort of unrelated to it. But if you want to look at the sort of using some of the stemness marker, this stuff is published, and you're right. They have looked into the spatial distribution of cells with different
and I mean the very recent spatial transcriptomics, like single cell transcription data. Then if you can get your hands on anything like this, then you might be able to run some other single cell transcription data, stem cell signatures in parallel to that. But that's not. I don't know how much this will reveal, because some papers signature of genes transcribed that correlate with stemness might not really be in line with another project, but that could be a route, a computational in bioinformatics intensive route of looking at this.
Okay,
it's an interesting take. I'd have to go and learn a lot more about it, I think, because when you said bioinformatics, my brain.
Well, that's where the field is headed, right? With all single cell RNA-seq, but now they have spatially explicit single cell RNA-seq, and then so one paper has a trope of stem-like signatures, and then another might have just transcriptomes with some spatial resolution, and then you can bring these together and say, let's now look for enrichment in cells for the stem signature from paper A based on the local spatial data in paper B, and gain some trust or confidence that they might overlap or not. I mean, if they don't exactly tell you what you wanted to hear, then you would say that it doesn't. You can't compare them, and if they do, then you probably say, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. Right? I mean, this is where the field is, right? So
cherry picking in bioinformatics.
Well, that's what we. But that's definitely where this is headed. So, talk about it in 2 years from now, and it's probably going to be much better.
Well, I'm going to have to do my homework then, because I have to admit my bioinformatics is, like most of my knowledge, is questionable at best. So you've given me some homework to do anyway, Philip. I'll have to go and look that up now.
Some of the just like Google spatial transcriptomics and stem cell signatures, and I think you might be able to find something. I'm not saying it's going to be of much help immediately, but
I'd be interested anyway. So that's a really interesting angle to take on it. So that is something I will check out and terrify myself with over the next few days, I'm sure.
Good luck.
You're muted, David.
It's better that way, David.
Yes, that once again, thanks.
We're deep in the talk.
Yes, I know. I just didn't want to disrupt us all. But well, David, thank you very much. And it was an excellent presentation. I think you get a lot of people who might want to talk to you after this. Personally, myself, probably in a day or two.
Well, again, anyone
Thanks,
that, just drop me an email or the bat signal or whatever else. I'm more than happy to. And it's always a pleasure to speak to everyone in the IMO. So please keep safe, and hopefully until I see you all again.
Likewise.